He has intimidated into silence or imprisoned or executed everyone within not just the CCP, but the broader system who is capable of independent thought.
The Foreign Ministry spokesman is in fact a wolf warrior from central casting. His job is to make Xi Jinping happy every morning when he looks at his television screen, less his job to convey accurately what the Chinese military are likely to do.
He no longer has advisors. No one wants to bring him information because they don't know how he's going to react. He has literally shot the messenger so many times that he is making decisions in the dark. Now, this has horrible implications for any economic system, but in a one-man show, it means nothing gets done unless the leader gives you a written order, or you're one of the zealots who sees him on TV and is like, oh, this must be what he meant. So when you see a small army of bureaucrats in head-to-toe surgical stuff out on a runway at an airport with a leaf blower spraying lime to disinfect the runway, that's the kind of policies we're getting out of China now. And of course, COVID. Now, we're in the Midwest. I'm going to guess that there is a diversity of opinions in the room about COVID. Some of us would probably side with vaccines, where others of us think that natural immunity is the way to go. And I think in the privacy of our own homes, when the door is closed and no one's listening, we do think to ourselves, maybe the other side has a point. Okay, is that safe? China doesn't have these options, and it's not because of government. China was very successful for 2 years at keeping COVID out. No one has natural immunity. And the Chinese domestically generated vaccine doesn't work. It barely worked against the wild strain out of Wuhan. It doesn't work at all versus the new stuff. And Omicron B, the one that is dominant in China and dominant here today, it's the most communicable virus pathogen that humans have ever struggled with. And the death rate from it is higher than any of the previous strains. And for us, this is a footnote because we all have multiple sources of resistance now. But the Chinese have none. And if they opened, you'd be looking at 5 million deaths in China a month for at least a quarter, minimum. So they can't. Lockdowns are their only policy tool. Shanghai went into lockdown on April 1. They came out on June 1. They nearly went into lockdown again last week. It's a little touch and go right now. We're all familiar with Vegas, right? What happens in Vegas totally leaves Vegas if it's a venereal disease. Yeah. China right now is struggling with an outbreak in Macau, which is their Vegas. So you should be expecting major metropolitan lockdowns across the country within a month. This is China's new normal. They can no longer participate in manufacturing supply chains because they can't keep the factories open. They are prioritizing health. That comes at a cost. They're going to be losing access to Russian crude because of the war. They're losing access to manufacturing and employment because of their health policy. And we're having government failure as a managerial issue. All that really leaves is food security. Now, we all know that they love their pork. And we all remember African swine fever from 3 years ago when they had to cull more hogs than the rest of the world has hogs commercially. They've offered a series of subsidies at the federal and the local levels in order to encourage hog farmers to re-enter the market, but they forgot to abrogate the debts of the hog farmers that went out of business because of ASF. So you've got 2 million dudes like me taking subsidies who have no idea what to do with a pig. And so they're buying food from everywhere in the world, even if it's not appropriate for hogs. So obviously they're going for soy and corn, but they're like getting broken rice out of India and like croissant grade wheat out of France to feed to pigs. Like the least efficient way to do it. And again, 2 million people who have no idea what they're doing. Now, according to Chinese statistics, there has been no ASF in the country for months. She gets it. Yeah. They're probably in the midst of a fairly significant outbreak again. The question is how far and how loud does it get before they have to do another absolutely top to bottom mass culling. Whether that happens this year or next year, I don't know, because Chinese data, And if they don't have pork, all they've got left is rice. Rice is the crop that is most phosphate intensive. And so the Chinese have traditionally been the world's largest producer and exporter of phosphate because it's a food security issue. Well, they've stopped all exports until further notice. So we've lost potash because of the Ukraine war. We've lost phosphate because of Chinese mismanagement. This is where the oil flows. The thicker the line, the more tankers are on that route. This is the route that matters the most. It is a convenient 6,000 to 7,000 mile sail from the Persian Gulf to the Chinese coast. Now, we've all heard those stories about the Chinese having this massive navy, over 600 ships, versus our 290. However, 90% of the Chinese fleet would fit in this auditorium. Not all at the same time, don't be a dumbass. One at a time. They don't have range. If no one shoots them so they can go slow and in a straight line to conserve fuel, they can go 1,000 miles, maybe. Most of them you're talking under 400 under a war scenario, whereas our fleet is entirely blue water. If there is a real conflict in which the Chinese are involved, someone who does not care for them, and that is a long list these days, is going to put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy line, and China deindustrializes within a year. They are the most vulnerable economy on the planet. And that's only the second reason why I don't see the Chinese surviving the decade. Texans, of course, know what this little spike is. This is what happened last January when Texas got cold. Prices almost tripled. And this right here, this little thing, this is what we're all bitching about right now. It's like we're nowhere near the 50-year average yet, folks. And yet this has got us ripping our hair out. You guys want to see what the Chinese and the Europeans are bitching about? Because this is so much fun. Europe's already in recession. I don't care what the statistics say. China would be in recession from this if it wasn't that they're probably in recession from the COVID lockdowns. 3 years minimum for this to be fixed, assuming the Ukraine war stops tomorrow. We are looking at not a recession, we are looking at an energy-induced depression that is affecting multiple continents, probably already. But not here. This gives us a competitive advantage in everything. The deep blue, the deep green, those are the world's major producers and exporters of grain and soy-based calories. Everyone else on the map is a net import. Countries that are in orange and red import at least half of the calories they consume. In a world where the fertilizer system breaks down, we've lost potash because of the Russians, we've lost phosphate because of the Chinese, and because of the natural gas price increases, a lot of Europeans have already stopped producing nitrogen. Here are the places that look 40% reduction in their ability to grow the crop in the first place. This is famine. We already know in the United States that a lot of farmers have crop switched away from corn and soy into things like hay that are less input intensive. We already know that in sub-Saharan Africa, they're just not using as. We won't have an idea of what yields might look like until probably mid-September. That's usually when we get our first good batch of data. We will easily be having 500,000 to 1 billion people this year suffering from malnutrition by year's end. And there's not a single thing going on in the world right now that suggests to me that any of the fertilizer interruptions are going to be solved this year or next year. In fact, I anticipate them all to get significantly worse. My mom's here. What do you have, like 37 brothers and sisters? Yeah. But globalization and industrialization means urbanization because people move into the cities to take value-added services and manufacturing jobs. And so when my mom moved into town, she went from being one of 37 to having 3 kids. Here's us. We've all heard, that blah, 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 the baby boomers, how are we going to afford their retirement? That's legitimate. But it's from a capital point that I'm really concerned. They're the largest generation we've ever had. They're moving into retirement. On average, the boomers retire in the fourth quarter of this year. We are almost there. And they're taking all of their money with them. They're going to lock it into very uninteresting things like T-bills, and they will stay there until they pass on, which on average will not be this decade. So we know that the velocity of capital isn't simply going to slow or stop, it is going to go into screaming reverse. And the cost of capital has to increase by at least a factor of 4 in the next 12 calendar months. The fact that we're going through an economic tightening cycle at the same time is just bad luck. It's going to magnify everything. Capital has never been this cheap, and it never will be this cheap again. Here are the big 4 economies of the world: the Europeans, the Chinese, the Japanese, and us. The bottom 2 were terminal 20 years ago. When your birth rate changes and you start having fewer kids, it doesn't manifest immediately. But if you do it for 60 years, it's not that you've run out of children. You ran out of children 40 years ago. You're running out of adults now. And we're looking at mass retirement across the world. Now, there is something very different about the American demography, and it's right here. We know them as millennials. Here's the number 1 reason why you should not expect to be selling anything to China by the end of the decade, perhaps as early as next year. That demographic structure was already the world's fastest aging workforce as of January of 2000. This is already well past the point of terminal collapse. If they were going to fix this, they missed it by 30 years. We now know that this data is wrong. The Chinese have completed their 10-year census. They're starting to release the data in bits and pieces. Not all at once because it's really bad. And they're now publicly admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom were born since the one-child policy was adopted, so people 40 and under, and the vast majority of whom were because of selective sex abortions applied en masse. The yellow bars probably don't exist. We don't have an economic theory that suggests that that leads to anything but full-scale societal collapse. It's just a question of whether it happens in 2029 or 2023. And when I look at the energy situation, and I look at the Ukraine war, and I look at the import disruptions and the flows and nationalism and Trump and Biden and all the rest, I gotta say, it's looking like it's going to be sooner rather than later. When I speak to pork groups for the last few years, I've been telling you, if you bet the farm on sales to China, you will lose the farm. It doesn't mean there's no hope. It does mean you need to look elsewhere. Final slide. This is CPI. The Americans and the Canadians, sibling countries, very similar. It tracks as you would expect. There have been 3 big phases for inflation since World War II. First, the original post-war build-out. This is when most of what we consider to be the advanced world fully industrialized. Remember, we didn't finish this process in the United States until the 60s. This is roads, this is power plants, this is asphalt, this is electrical grids. Industrial, demand-driven inflation. Then we had the baby boomers come of age. Houses, cars, kids. Consumer-driven demand inflation. And then we had this glorious period that we all think of as normal. The Soviet system collapsed, and an empire's worth of raw commodities was dumped on global markets, whether it was oil and gas, or wood, or wheat, or aluminum. Kept prices low for a generation. And the Chinese entered the global system in 1989, 1 billion workers, pushing down the cost of manufactured goods. We had 30 years of the lowest inflation ever recorded in human history. It is not normal. And it's ending. The Chinese labor is going away. The Russian commodities are going away. And we have to deal with a double spike now. Because while the baby boomers are retiring, the millennials are here. And they're in the prime of their consumption years. And we need to double the size of the industrial plant in the next 5 years. Every disinflationary trend we have benefited from in the last generation is flipping. And every inflationary trend we have dealt with in the last 2 generations is coming back on steroids. Your mid-case scenario should be inflation of 9 to 15% for at least the next 5 years. Now, I realize that's kind of a but it will likely also be paired with the fastest economic growth we have seen in this country in decades. There's not a lot that the government can do to make this easier. There is a lot the government can do to make it worse. And when I look at who we've elected the last 3 times, I can't say I'm overly confident there. But your sector produces the thing we can't live without. I don't care what happens with government policy when it comes to agriculture, because the macroeconomic, the secular, the demographic, the geopolitical trends that are hitting the rest of global agriculture are devastating and they cannot be adapted to. Here you don't face any of that.